California increases the minimum wage for fast food workers to $20 per hour, and that's $20 US as well. So, for those of you who are wondering, just to put that into perspective, I believe the minimum wage in Ontario is around $16 Canadian per hour. Correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe I don't have the latest data, but I just remember when I was in high school, the minimum wage was like $10.25 Canadian per hour. And if you're a student or if you're like under 18 or something, because I think I got my first part-time job when I was 17. So if you're under 18, they are allowed to somehow pay you less, which doesn't make sense. But like I was making like $9.60 per hour at my first job ever. So I worked at the meat counter at this grocery store called Longo's, which is like a expensive Italian themed grocery store here in grocery chain, right? So here in Ontario. But yeah, anyways, those days are long past. But arguably, you could argue that maybe $9.60 back then. So this looks like what year was this? Like 2012, 2013. Like maybe $9 back then is worth more than $16 now, right? But anyways, that's a whole nother debate. We're talking about California here, which increased it to 20 US dollars per hour. And shockingly, you can see that the prices for just fast food in general has gone up dramatically. Well, not dramatically, but like it's noticeably gone up, right? So this is a screenshot. If you guys look at the docket, this is a screenshot of the prices at In-N-Out Burger on March 29th versus April 1st. So the minimum wage increase went into effect on April 1st, April Fool's Day, except it wasn't April Fool's, it was real. So the double, not the coffee, but that's just what they call the burger at In-N-Out went from $5.65 to $5.90. Cheeseburger went from $3.95 to $4.10. Hamburger went from $3.50 to $3.60. French fries stayed the same at $2.30. Shakes went from $2.95 to $3. So not like dramatic increases, but noticeable, right? And if you eat there all the time, eventually you will notice the price increases. So in particular, I wanted to talk about this one restaurant called Foster's, which is in, I forget which town it's in. I think it's called Lemoore, California, where they basically just closed because they couldn't afford the extra, labor costs due to this minimum wage hike. And funny enough, I saw a news article about this where the workers thought that it was an April Fool's joke because the owner literally was trying to stretch to, at least this is according to what the owner said, he was trying to stretch like his last dollar to the very end. And he realized that he couldn't survive with the mandated wage increases, but he didn't want to ruin everybody's Easter just because it just so happened to coincide with Easter. So he kind of delayed the news until the last minute possible. And on April Fool's Day, he was, kind of forced to tell everyone that the restaurant was closing and everyone was laid off. And at first, the employees didn't believe them, didn't believe the owner. And then they came into work on April 2nd and they were locked out because the restaurant was just shut down. So, yeah, basically, why I wanted to talk about this was, there's been kind of maybe I would say a leftward shift in politics in both Canada and the United States. I would say, right? Again, I'm not trying to be partisan. I'm just making an observation, right? So the climate, like what is the mainstream acceptable opinions, have kind of shifted leftward. And one of the results on these, especially left-leaning states like California, is that there's been a lot of efforts to increase the minimum wage. And I'm not saying that people don't deserve this minimum wage hike, but my point is that there are consequences to hiking the minimum wage, because you're going to drive a lot of restaurants out of business, like what we saw with Foster's in Lemoore, California, where restaurants, especially fast food restaurants, are notoriously they run on notoriously thin margins, and if you increase the minimum wage a lot to like, I think this is the highest in the country, right? Um, it's gonna have a negative effect, right? And it, I just think that a lot of people are not really aware of these kinds of like, they don't have the understanding of the economics enough to really be able to make these types of decisions properly. Where you have politicians saying that we're going to raise the minimum wage and we're going to make sure that everybody can make a living, and then they get elected and then they actually implement these policies, and then people discover it's like, oh, I was making $15 an hour before, and the minimum wage got hiked to $20, but I got laid off, so now I'm making $0 per hour, right? And people don't realize that until it hits them like a truck, like what happened at Foster's. So like, if you watch I'll put a link down below to the news interview if I can find that clip. But basically, it's like, people saying that I was shocked that I was laid off. Like, I was excited to like get the $20 per hour minimum wage, and then now I don't have a job, and now I have to look for a new job. And I'm like, bro, you probably, if you voted for this, right? Like, this is the natural consequence of what you voted for. Like, and I'm sorry that you were duped. Like, but this is just my opinion. Let me pass it off to you guys. What do you guys think about all this this story?
Well, like first and foremost, $20 USD is really nice. Like if you really think about it, since we're from Canada, our dollar's a lot weaker than the down below. So if you're getting that just from like a fast food service, that would be really nice. But what
It's
were you
really
gonna?
nice if you can get it, right? That's
Yeah,
my whole point. It's like if you're one of the people that don't get laid off because of this minimum wage hike, then you're rolling. But like, yeah, the point is that, like, would you rather be making $15 an hour, or would you rather be making $0 an hour? Right? So this is kind of the crux of the issue. But yeah, anyway, sorry I cut you off.
no, but like I guess that's where I was going. I kind of agree with you. It's like, yeah, if you can manage to slide in and get like $20, excuse me, that would be amazing. But I feel like for a lot of companies, especially like small business owners, like Foster's, for example, they're already on like super thin margins, like just because of the economic structure of today's like society. So like inevitably things like layoffs may happen just because they won't be able to sustain their like business or whatnot. So yeah, what is better really, like $0 salary or $15 salary? So is this really the right move to put it up to $20 per hour? Maybe not. Maybe it might be a little too much, but at the same time, if you can land a job for 20 just for like working at McDonald's, Burger King, or like In and Out, then congratulations. But it'll be a lot harder for a lot of other companies too as well. Sucks. It really sucks.
Yeah, so just to jump in here on the topic at hand, I think a lot of people don't understand the economic side of it. So I kind of want to talk about that for a quick second. But by increasing the minimum wage, which is effectively breaking the supply and demand curve, in the sense of like the equilibrium of the supply and demand curve will be right, in the middle of them, and that will be at some price where people are willing to work and the company is willing to pay for that labor, and that is theoretically the most optimal, in the sense of like the most people are employed at that level, but or at least like the most people are employed at a reasonable amount of money at that level. And by introducing a minimum wage, you are basically making it so that the demand, more people are willing to work for that wage, but the supply side, more companies cannot afford to pay that wage. So there is a disadvantage of having that wage increase put in. And if that is not understood, then the downside will be that people will lose jobs. And I think that on that front, that's just the kind of the economics of the topic. But like on that front, I think it's also important to remember that the economics of the fast food business do not necessarily reflect the cost of living for that location. So a lot of these people who will be working for $20 an hour will be, even with $20 an hour, they may be struggling to afford to pay their rent, their cost of living in general. So just because they've gotten $20 doesn't mean that they're gonna be significantly better off. That being said, if you are making $20 full time and previously were making $15, you will obviously be better off. But I'm just saying that these people will still be having to spend a lot of money on their living expenses either way, and that in this regard, you will also see, as we can see with that In-N-Out price increase, that the companies will just pass the costs on to the consumer, and the consumer has to be willing to pay that additional cost in order to keep facilitating those employees being paid at a higher rate. So it's functionally they are the government is basically trying to force the wage higher artificially, and because of that fact, the wage may the number of people who lose their jobs may be substantial as a result of that, such as the people at the Fosters who suddenly found out they didn't have a job anymore. So there are pros and downsides, because at the same time, you also don't want scenarios where you have a company hiring, say, a bunch of people who are willing to work for basically pennies, and preventing the average person from, having basically, sorry, like they're you don't want people who will work for pennies coming in and taking all those jobs, and then the people who would be wanting a normal wage and want to be able to live with like just their family or whatever, instead of having to have a lot of people in a different all together in a household. You don't necessarily want to be in a scenario where those people are unable to afford things, which is kind of why there is a minimum wage. Is basically there so that the corporations will have a harder time taking advantage of people who are willing to work for significantly lower incomes. But because of the fact that there are big cost of living and a lot of disadvantages to that approach, basically having a minimum wage has some pluses and some drawbacks that I think are pretty clear to see. And I think that's a good segue for Andy to go into the next section on this.
Yeah, actually, before I go into the next section, I actually wanted to add to what you said, right? So, like, what is again, I keep on saying this phrase tonight, but it's what is the crux of the issue, right? So, I think that for this particular story, the crux of the issue is that or I say we, but California, like in this particular story, California has approached this minimum wage topic, which is an economic issue, with a lens of a social justice warrior. So they're approaching like an issue that is economic in nature with the social justice sense. And what do I mean by that, right? So I think the narrative that's surrounding this minimum wage increase has been that these big corporations, these fast food corporations like McDonald's or Burger King or whatever, they're abusing their workers and forcing them to work these jobs for these wages that they can't support themselves, right? So it's like the greed of these corporations that's causing these issues. So we need to kind of rein in the corporate greed by increasing the minimum wage. And I think that's just the wrong way to approach this, because we got to keep in mind, first of all, that no one's putting a gun to your head and forcing you to work at Burger King, right? So if you feel that, let's say if you're making $15 an hour before, if you feel that that is like an abusive wage and you're not really like you're not being valued and your work it should be worth more, then you can quit, right? Like no one's forcing you to work there. So you signed a contract when you agreed to be hired for that job, right? So like that contract clearly states how much you're gonna make. So you agreed to that. You signed the paper, right? Otherwise, you're like illegally working, which is like another um, can of worms altogether. But assuming that you're a legal citizen, you're able to enter into contract, you sign the contract, you sign on the dotted line, and the contract clearly says how much you will be paid, right? So you agreed to that. So you can't really say that they're abusing you unless there's like workplace safety measures and stuff like that. That's like, that's a whole, again, that's another whole can of worms. But assuming that, you perform the duties and they're not asking you for anything that is not specified on your contract, and you agree to the wages, then, what's wrong with that, right? And um, yeah, basically by implementing a minimum wage that's so high that you're disrupting these free market economics, and that's causing issues. What's going to happen is that it's going to drive a lot of restaurants out of business, and it's going to decrease the supply and decrease competition of these fast food places. So the fast food restaurants that are left, well, because there's less competition, maybe they'll be even more liberal in terms of raising their prices, and that's going to cause more issues for the cost of living for the consumer, right? So segue into the next segment of this story. So this is related to what we've been talking about. So I have this kind of revolutionary idea, which is not really revolutionary because a lot of countries are already doing it, which is why have a minimum wage at all? Like, why can't we just get rid of the minimum wage? And I know that that is a very triggering statement, and a lot of people are going to come at me for just saying that. But honestly, ask yourself, why do we have to have a minimum wage, right? So you might be surprised to find out that there's actually quite a few countries in the European Union that do not have a minimum wage, and they're not like backwater, third world countries. These are developed first world nations. So examples are Denmark, Italy, Austria, Finland, and Sweden do not have a minimum wage, a national minimum wage. So, like Sweden and Finland and, Denmark, these are places with actually, quite high prices, overall. And they didn't feel the need to kind of reach the government of these countries. They didn't feel the need to reach their hand into the minimum wage market and like kind of mandate that the minimum wage has to be so and so that the greedy corporations don't abuse their workers. And I think that if you ask anyone working in the fast food industry from Denmark or Sweden, they most likely they're actually treated better than fast food workers in America and even in California and like Canada even, right? So as we can see, is not necessarily, I don't think it's an issue with like the minimum wage. Like you have to set a minimum wage to guarantee like a standard of living. The crux of the issue is that we're approaching this issue all wrong, right? We need an economic solution, not a social justice solution. And right now, the way that California has approached this is it'll lead to a big disaster, I think. But anyways, pass it back to you guys. What do you guys think?
I think oh yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, okay. You can go if you want.
Sure. I don't have too much to say about this, but like yeah, I think genuinely like no minimum wage in these like specific European countries is quite interesting. And then like to the point where I think a few of these countries that actually don't have minimum wage are actually a lot more happier. Like overall, it's quite interesting. I don't know the specifics and whether or not that would change like our economy if said we just eliminated the minimum wage. Like I don't know if necessarily that'll do us any better, but if it comes down to it, and then it may seem like a viable solution, then why not give it a go? And then who knows, it might actually possibly work. And then if there's like statistics like indicating like these like non-minimum wage countries are actually benefiting from this, which as of right now I don't know about, then yeah, what's stopping us from not doing it as well? So I
No,
think
but
not a bad
here's
idea.
here's the issue, right? If you're a politician and you're running on a campaign to get rid of the minimum wage, then you'll just get canceled like automatically. Right?
Yeah.
There's no way that you're gonna get elected on a platform like that, even though like as we can see, it works in some parts of the world, in some of these developed European countries, right? So and the reason, by the way, why I think it would work is that you just let market dynamics take over, right? Like if it's too cheap, like if you think that your work is not being valued, you're being paid too cheaply, then you can just quit, and like the market will find its equilibrium, right? But yeah, Tristan, what do you have to
Yeah. So let me jump in here and clarify some things, since I don't think we are necessarily the most knowledgeable on the Sweden, Denmark, whatever's their labor laws. But the big reason why they are able to function without minimum wage is actually because they have a substantial number of unions and employers organizations, etc., that negotiate the wages, and basically set minimums based on the sectors that they're in, rather than a federally mandated minimum wage. So in essence, instead of the government going $20 is the flat, everyone $20, that's it. They have the unions of these different sectors, in these different sectors, having a collective bargain where they go bring this to the table of the companies and are basically like, we will, this is how much we expect to be paid, and this is what this is our expectations, and this is what we will work for, etc., and this is the increases that we expect, etc. And because of that, they are because they're negotiating with them as a collective force, they're able to navigate the risks of the minimum wage. And I think that is actually a far more efficient way to come to a minimum wage than a government mandated one, because like I don't think that all jobs should be necessarily at, say, a $15 flat rate, right? Whereas I think that some jobs should be, higher, that are currently at minimum wage, and some jobs that could be lower that are currently at minimum wage, right? So because of the fact that they have these unions and these group organizations that negotiate with the corporations, they have to come to an agreement on the wages. And I think that means that they will have a better ability to come to an equilibrium ish, even if it's not 100%. But I guess when it comes right down to it, like the equilibrium for a supply and demand for that labor market is basically one of, if the people are willing to work for that amount and the company is willing to pay that amount, essentially collective bargaining should come as close to that amount as one would as possible, because the company would be going, no, we can't pay that amount more, and the collective bargaining would be going, well, we aren't going to work unless you give us XYZ. And then they can negotiate to the point where they get as close to the equilibrium as they can. Whereas with the federally mandated minimum wage system, it's very much just like, this is the lowest, this is the floor. And if your company, if the equilibrium for you and your staff is higher than that, it doesn't matter. But if it's lower than that, there's no real room for the company to push back on that and be like, no, I think that, the value that we're doing does not like, this business is not profitable if we pay $20 an hour, but it would be profitable if we paid $15 an hour. And the collective bargaining folks could be like, okay, we can, how about 16, and then they can come to something that's closer to the a more reasonable rate. rather than just as Andy was saying, like the kind of the social justice, like, oh, you can't live off less than $20 in California, therefore we should have $20 minimum wage, which by extension removes a lot of people who would be capable of working at, say, $16, $17 that if there was some form of bargaining and would be willing to work for that amount, that is not. And I think that really comes down to the fact that there's been there's a substantial anti-union and collective bargaining culture in North America particularly that is not quite there in it's not as prominent in Europe, etc. And I think it's also clear to mention that unions can have downsides. So I'm not saying that they're 100% good, but I think they can be a very helpful thing to have around, especially if we consider the fact that our good old-fashioned 40-hour work week came from unions. So prior to that, it was many more hours, just to clarify, in case you were thinking, oh, the unions gave us 40 hours. I don't like that. It used to be like 60 to 80. So they got us down to 40. So thank the unions for that one, at least.
Yeah, I mean, I would be willing to, even though I'm more of a proponent of, free market capitalism, having unions decide and having collective bargain, I'm not against that. And I think that's a better, like, more precise solution than, the government just coming in and, because like when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So it's just kind of like the government mandating a federal minimum wage is kind of like using a hammer when you should be using like a fine screwdriver or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm. Like a scalpel.
Yeah. So I think that this is like something that this is a conversation that we should have. And unfortunately in California, they either didn't have this conversation or maybe the government just like won out in that case. But yeah, I think that this is a really bad thing for the California government to do. And it's just gonna, like, California already has, I think it is like California and New York are always the two states that have the highest cost of living in the United States. And I think that California is going to get that crown back in terms of highest cost of living state with this new policy. So, yeah, I just think that maybe I'm letting my kind of libertarian bias show right now, but I just think that it's very dangerous to empower the central government to make these broad sweeping legislation that affects everyone, right? So you can kind of see it by my opinions on the carbon tax, which is another example that we've talked ad nauseum here on this show over and over again. And my opinion around the federal minimum wage is kind of the same. It's like because these like greedy corporations, or at least that's the narrative, right? These greedy corporations are exploiting their workers, even though the workers signed a contract saying that they agreed to this pay. It doesn't matter. We're gonna like smash the corporations by implementing this minimum wage. It's just like, I don't care how much the cost of living is. I'm gonna tax the greedy corporations for emitting carbon. Because they're polluting the environment. So it's just like time and time again, we've seen governments use these broad sweeping legislation to implement things that affects that affects pretty much everyone in the country. And I just think that it introduces more harm than good, right? So we can talk about like the media censorship laws as well, but I'll leave that conversation for another day. Because I don't want this show to run on for 3 more hours. But yeah, anyways, that's my thoughts on that.
Just quickly, one last thing to jump in here regarding the strategy that like Sweden, Denmark, etc. has adopted. I think that it's actually really interesting that they've kind of gone the union route for setting their minimum wage, in the sense of like, to me, it does kind of seem like that would be the most likely to reach as close to an equilibrium of where the people are being paid as much as they can be to be happy, working at that job, and the company can be earning sufficient money from that labor to justify having that each additional person at that rate. I find it really interesting, given that like I feel like that's a way more efficient way of deciding a minimum wage than just this blanket strategy, as Andy was basically alluding to, with the government just whipping out the hammer and setting it all. And I just really want to kind of emphasize that I'm just very because I didn't realize necessarily that was kind of their mentality, but it seems to me like that's probably the best. Because one other factor that we didn't really touch on is too much is the fact that the government kind of like it sets the rate of the minimum wage, but you or I don't get to give feedback on what that rate should be, right? Like we can vote for the person who says I want minimum wage set to $20, but that's basically as far as it goes, right? I can't go, well, maybe $17 is more reasonable, right? Like there's no way for us to affect it. But theoretically, in like the more union Swedish model, they can have, an individual can theoretically give their opinions and feedback to a union, and assuming the union is, functional and doing its job, that feedback should be taken into account when negotiating with the corporation. So it's actually pretty interesting.
Well, on that note, I think it illustrates another problem, which I call the tyranny of the majority, right? I didn't invent this term. It's like, it's just, it describes a situation where the majority can always outvote the opinions of the minority, even though, the majority might be wrong, right? So in this case, it's like, there's always going to be more fast food workers than there are fast food business owners, right? So the business owners have an incentive to push labor costs as low as possible, and the workers have an incentive to push that labor cost as much as possible upwards. So if a politician is running for office and they just need to get the most amount of votes to get elected, what do you think they're going to say? They're going to say, okay, if I get elected, if you vote for me, I'm going to increase the federal minimum wage or the state minimum wage in this case, because it's just California, but I'm going to make the minimum wage $20 per hour. And then next year, another politician says, he's shortchanging you. I'm actually going to increase it to $30 an hour. And like, because there's more fast food workers, they're always going to be attracted to the person who's promising the most. And it doesn't matter if the business owners vote against it, because there's just so many like more workers than there are business owners, right? So it becomes a tyranny of the majority, where there's an incentive for politicians to kind of dial into the anger of the fast food workers, and like promising more than what frankly it should be, right? Because if we keep on increasing the minimum wage, at one point it will become too high. Now we can maybe have an argument as to whether $20 per hour is already too high or is not enough, but at some point, if it keeps going up, it will be too high. And I think that's a bit of an issue, right, that you're going to have, where it just escalates, because you're always going to have a whole bunch of people that are trying to drive up this minimum wage more and more, and you get voted in to office if you're a politician that promises more, even though it ends up damaging everyone.
Yeah, and I think another factor is that I think wages in general is one area in which I think the free market has a harder time managing, because of the obscurity of wages. The fact that you don't know how much other people are being paid in most like North America makes it much more difficult for an individual to negotiate a wage with their employer, which is also something that I think was an area where the collective bargaining strategy seems to be have an advantage is because theoretically they should all know, generally speaking, what the wages are being made by everyone, which means that you can go into it with an expectation of what you should be being paid, so that the scenarios where you have people being underpaid or overpaid are not as such of a wide range, right? Where you've got someone getting $2 million to do nothing but sit in a chair and like spin, or then someone who is, you know, working like crazy and making $30,000 a year, but they're keeping some, you know, that one lady at every company that's got an amazing Excel spreadsheet that no one else knows how to work. That lady, she's making 30K. You know, she's keeping the whole company together. But and like maybe says, you know, she would be higher paid if there was less obscurity on salary. And I think that's one of the big issues with salaries here. It's like you don't know what other people are being paid, so it's harder to gauge if you're being underpaid, overpaid, whatever.